So I had all of these issues that I had to deal with as I sat down to write the book. And I'm a formalist by training. My mentor at the University of Iowa was structure, structure, structure kind of guy. So the first place I went looking for an answer was in structure, how to lay out and plot the story in a way that would be believable for readers. And I had a fairly traditional linear narrative to work with. I mean, I had a very clearly defined beginning, middle, and end to the story, and it was recognizable. So that part wasn't hard at all. My real challenge, I discovered, lay in characterization, or self-characterization in a memoir. And I knew that I had to create a narrator, a stand-in for myself, essentially, a character to represent myself 9 years ago. At the time I was writing the book, it was 6 years ago, who had a character arc that was easily recognizable and also believable. And I knew that readers needed to be able to trace not just my journey to Central America and through Central America, but my inner journey, which is the real story, from a skeptical, cynical East Coast intellectual to someone who became open to the possibilities of the unseen. To do this, I made a choice that I couldn't believe I made, but I chose to write the story in the present tense. I don't like writing in the present tense. I usually discourage my students from writing in the present tense because I think that the retrospective analysis you get from writing in the past tense adds so much to a story. But I realized that I needed to have the reader experience the events with me as they unfolded in the book, to go on the journey with me in real time, and to partake in the illusion that neither one of us knew more than the other, that they were learning and changing with me as I traveled from place to place throughout Belize and into Guatemala. So I decided to write in the present tense. And writing in the present tense is a great exercise, and I do have my students write in the present tense to unlock memories and re-inhabit the self of the past, but then I usually ask them to change it back to the past tense. This time I stayed in the present tense. It was harder than I would have thought to get back into the mindset of who I was 9 years ago before this trip took place, because the trip itself changed me so fundamentally. But back then I was a very lost and restless person. I was, by some standards, a person of privilege, but not of gratitude. I was anxious, I was well-meaning, I was scared. I was like anybody else, I was imperfect. Not that I'm perfect now by any stretch of the imagination, but I was really imperfect back then. So without the ability to reflect back on the past, to use the past tense to reflect back on who I was with insight and compassion and explain that to the readers, that's who I was then, this is what I understand now, I just had to jump in and, like I said, own who I was back then and inhabit that character and hope that readers would be willing to accept it and relate to the narrator enough to want to go on a journey with her and stick with her for 320 odd pages. The possibility of everything in its, the reviewers have been very generous with this book, and I am truly grateful for that. Although they do tend to emphasize the child in trouble, taking her down to the bush doctor in the cabin to get rid of the evil spirits angle. To me, that's there. What I'm telling you, it's a wacky story. It's there, but to me, that's just the catalyst for the adventure, really. That's the reason that we went. To me, the book is the story of how the belief system that I had held for all of my adult life, 36 years up to that point, was cracked open and reassembled in a different configuration by the end of our 10 days in Central America. And 10 days is pretty fast to undergo a transformation. So I needed to plot the whole story very carefully and very judiciously so that readers could experience my transformation as it unfolded. And in doing so, while writing the book, I realized it was not the truth of the events per se that readers would have to believe in, but in the authenticity of the narrator herself, in her voice and in her thoughts and in her life. And if they liked and trusted her, then maybe they would be willing to believe that what happened to her next in the story really did happen, or at least to suspend their disbelief long enough to take the journey with her and decide for themselves in the end. To do this, it became absolutely critical to emphasize reflection in the writing. Kami will remember this. In my nonfiction classes, I talk with my students all the time about balancing narration and reflection. in their nonfiction writing, and how good nonfiction writing moves seamlessly back and forth between the two, so that once you're into the reading experience, you don't even recognize that it's going on. Some of my students remember even years later how I take some pieces by Joan Didion, and I highlight all the narration in blue and all the reflection in yellow, and then I hold, after they've read the piece, I hold it up for them to show them how she's moving in and out. Sometimes in the course of a paragraph, she goes back and forth, sentence to sentence, and they didn't realize it. It's all held together, but then we can see it's a great visual exercise for your students to see how a master of balancing narration and reflection works with it. I have always believed that a memoir without much reflection is fast-paced and can be a great entertaining story, but often reads very episodically. This happened, and that happened, and that happened, and this happened. And a memoir with too much reflection can feel slow and weighed down unless you're really interested in the author's inner thoughts. So it's always a challenge to get the balance just right, and I do that through revision, revision, revision. Every chapter in this book was revised at least 10 to 12 times, over and over and over again. It took me a year and a half to, well, it took me 5 years to write the first 100 pages, and then 14 months to write the next 220, basically. That's because it was 5 years before I got a contract, and then 14 months after, and suddenly I was on a deadline, and I had to get going. I'm going to read you a few short scenes from the book to give you an idea of how the narrator that I created changes internally over the course of the story, with much of it conveyed through reflection and some of it through dialogue too, which is a great tool for conveying a character's inner thoughts. And I'll give you just a little bit of commentary in between so you can keep up with the story. And hopefully this will illustrate what I've been discussing.